All right. Greetings. Today is an exciting day as we celebrate and recognize Freedom Day, otherwise known as Juneteenth. It's a moment of inspiration and celebration for many African Americans. I am Brian K. Smith, the Dean of College Counseling and English Instructor at Marlborough School, and I'm joined by my colleague, Mr. Jonathon Allen, Chair of the History Department. Mr. Allen and I are excited to have our two great guests guide us through a conversation about Juneteenth. Dr. Courtney Joseph is the Assistant Professor of History and African American Studies at Lake Forest College, a national liberal arts institution located just north of the city of Chicago. Mr. Allen?
And Dr. Brenda Stevenson is a professor of African American Studies and Nickoll Family Endowed Chair at UCLA. I first met Dr. Stevenson 2 or 3 years ago when she was leading a panel entitled Why Statues Matter, a conversation that seems just as relevant today as it did 3 years ago. And Dr. Stevenson also generously came to campus to speak with our US history students this year about LaTosha Harlins and the uprisings in Los Angeles in the early 1990s. So thank you both very much for taking the time to be with us today.
You're welcome.
Yes, thank you so much. And there's a dog, so I'm gonna.
Okay. So actually, Dr. Stevens, I'm just going to start with you because you did a podcast on this very issue 2 years ago on Juneteenth. And it seems like now our context has shifted just a little bit. I mean, we have sustained 3-week-long national protests, marches, international support, all amidst the backdrop of a global pandemic. But before we actually talk about that, Dr. Stevenson, can you just kind of situate Juneteenth in its historical context? For those familiar with the end of the Civil War, but not familiar with the concept of Juneteenth, why did it take over 2.5 years for Juneteenth to become a thing? And why did it take place in Galveston, Texas?
Well, emancipation really didn't come to most people who were of African descent until the end of the Civil War. So we think about the Emancipation Proclamation, which came into effect on January 1st, 1863. But indeed, that didn't free most people because you had to be able to claim your freedom in order to have your freedom. First of all, and then secondarily, it only applied to those areas of the United States that were in rebellion against the United States. In other words, those areas that were a part of the Confederate States of America. And so, with both those things going on, as well as a war going on, a very destructive and violent war, particularly in the Upper South, most people weren't able to gain their freedom then. I just also want to remind the audience that about 10% of African Americans were already free, with various kinds of gradual emancipations that occurred during the time of the American Revolution and right after the time of the American Revolution. So why Galveston and why June 19th, 1865? So because Texas was on the frontier of slavery and slave society at the time, many people who lived there, who had taken their enslaved property there during the Civil War to escape the Civil War and to escape the end of slavery, were resisting any notion that indeed they had to free their slaves. So many people left specifically for that reason. They left from Virginia, Maryland, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi to get to Texas because they thought the Union Army would not get there. And therefore, if the war turned into a war for freedom, it would not impact them. But the war finally did get there. And General Grangers finally did get there as representative of the Union forces with about 2,000 other soldiers into, the Gulf and to Galveston Island, and read the proclamation, which indeed said that enslaved people were now free. And so this is one of the last places that the proclamation is read. But it's not the last place, but there were 250,000 enslaved men, women, and children who were Black in Texas at the time. And this does signal the end of racialized bondage for them.
I want to ask, thank you, Dr. Joseph, thinking about the proclamation and what General Granger read, can you center on a particular piece of that proclamation? Which piece of that is most important as you read it in hearing this message?
I'm going to echo a lot of what Dr. Stevenson said, which, it's an honor to be on this with you, Dr. Stevenson, since I know you know what you're talking about. So this is excellent, and I hope to add to it, right? And so
thank you.
I think that there's two parts that are actually, or I'd say three parts that are really important to reading that order number 3 that Dr. Stevenson was talking about. And one of which that I just actually learned today, which shows that we're always learning, right? And that's important as educators, and just even for the students, the audience who's watching this, there's always more to learn. And so it's okay if that's always happening. But the part that people really remember that Dr. Stevenson was talking about was this first line: the people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with the proclamation from the executive of the United States, which would be the president, all slaves are free. So that's the thing. That's the first line, and that's really what people remember about that order. However, the second and third parts, I think, are equally as important to understand what comes after, right? And so there's the sentence that reads, and I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence unless necessary in self-defense. And I recommend them in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. So they're already putting in that declaration, right? He's already saying okay, you may be angry that you just found out that slavery has been over and has been over for some time. You're late to the game, but this is not the time to, in a negative or in a quote violent way, retaliate. So I think that's a really interesting point. The other thing is the connection, therefore, it's actually heretofore, a good old word, existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freemen are advised to remain quietly at their present home and work for wages. So it's already telling them, don't leave, don't be mad. It's not slave master. It's not like you can just leave here. We're suggesting and actually telling you to stay where you're at, and now you will be working for your former master. We've switched that relationship right there. And so I think that while Juneteenth obviously is very much important in that it marks the time when belatedly people find out that the Emancipation Proclamation has happened and that the 13th Amendment is coming, because this happened 6 months before the 13th Amendment is ratified. There's also already those little loopholes that are already being put into place that say freedom doesn't necessarily look as free as you think it's going to be.
Thank you. Dr. Stevenson, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I would like to add that, this is indicative of what freedom was for those 10% of African Americans who were already free prior to the beginning of the Civil War. So that if people look at what happens to Black people who had been emancipated in 1865, if they look at that and then they look at what had happened previously, what was the life of free Blacks prior to the Civil War, one would see a very restricted freedom. One would see a freedom in which people were marginalized economically, politically, certainly, and also socially, where many places did not even allow those people to live, and that segregation was a rule and the law of the day. So oftentimes we think about segregation being developed in the American South and happening, after Reconstruction or during Reconstruction, but it already had existed in every place in the United States, including the American South, when we had this very small portion of people. And the other thing I'd like to add is that by the time that Juneteenth happens, Abraham Lincoln has already been assassinated. He is already dead. And so what you have now in the White House is a Southerner. And you have a person who is not invested in equality, certainly not racial equality, but I want to also add and neither was Lincoln. Lincoln did not believe in the equality of Black people, did not believe that Black people were naturally the same as white people, and he was very much invested in colonization, that is, removing Black people out of the nation into some place where we could thrive, but he didn't see that as being the United States. So it's a very interesting moment. And we think about this moment as one of great liberation and great hope and moving forward. But it's also bound to traditions of inequality and a different kind of citizenship that does not reflect the ideals as we now think of them of the nation.
Yeah.
I want to jump in really quickly here, because as Dr. Joseph was reading that, I was hung on the fact that they said that the slaves were told not to celebrate, not to move from your location, to do anything different. I mean, I would find that disingenuous. I would feel like I need to celebrate. All these years I've been enslaved, and now you're telling me I can't celebrate this freedom. Am I reading that wrong? It's like, I'm not exactly sure how I felt about that.
I mean, I echo many of the things that Dr. Stevenson said about how this is restricted right away. And, you know, it's important to think about these as baby steps that, you know, although the ending of chattel slavery is a huge thing, and it should be remembered as a very important moment, it gets clouded up as this whitewash narrative of Lincoln freed the slaves, were free, and after the Civil War, racism's over, everything's great for some time. You know, and Lincoln is a very nuanced individual. I argue that Lincoln is somebody who we should study as someone who was doing the unlearning of racist ideology, like, over his life, but wasn't able to fully realize that because he is assassinated for even having the, even thinking about doing some of that unlearning, right? The fact that he starts to, you know, after he did, as Dr. Stevenson said, I joke with my students, you know, Lincoln tries everything else than to free the slaves. I mean, Lincoln's like, but what if we do it like later? And they're like, and he's like, okay, but like, what if we send them all to Haiti? And he does at some point. He sends a group of 500 free Black people to Haiti, but you can't just do that. This is not the land that they're used to. This is not the climate they're used to. This is not the culture they're used to. So this idea that even if slavery's over, racial harmony, that was, you know, a racial reconciliation, integration, no. That wasn't what comes, even though we have this June 19th, you know, 1865 moment.
So given those limitations of freedom and those loopholes that you both have suggested, to what extent did they celebrate? And what was the reaction of the formerly enslaved communities to this news?
Well, there were celebrations. I mean, I think one of the things that the declaration that was read meant was that not to upset the white folk. I mean, I think that's exactly what they meant. So there was all this fear by slaveholding people and non-slaveholding people as well who were white, that Black people would all of a sudden become really violent, that they would take out the brutal treatments that they had received and the separation from their families and the, you know, all these abuses, that they would now go on a rampage and begin to kill white people, begin to reenact, you know, the Nat Turner revolt, or, you know, etc. And so there was much more focus on that. So how do you control that? You control that by saying not gathering together, don't leave where you were living, you know, don't go into the towns, don't gather in the countryside, because you might be celebrating, but, you know, that could turn very easily into let's get them back now. All right. So I think those parts of what was read really was to reassure white people. All right. And it's not only to reassure white people that we're going to control Black people, All right. It's also to keep white people from going out and killing Black people who are now free. And that happened a lot, much more than we talk about. A lot of people killed their slaves rather than free them. You know, and there are some witnesses to, you know, the murdering rampages that took place, you know, not just in Texas, but across the South and other places as well, because people said, if you're not, you know, I'm not going to give away my property. I'm not being reimbursed, which also Lincoln wanted to do, was reimburse slaveholders for the loss of their
as well. And doesn't he do that with the border states?
He did that. He wanted to do that with the border states. He did a little bit with the border states, but of course the British had done it in the 1830s. The French did it in the 1840s. And so, you know, he was following that model and saying, we're going to reimburse, which would have completely bankrupt the nation for generations, not just for years. And so, you know, there was just all this great fear of what would come out of this. But also, I think Black people just decided, I'm going to celebrate anyway. I'm not staying here. You know, first of all, we have been spread hither and thither all over the place. So people immediately just left to go try to find their family members, to go get their children back, to go find their mother, you know, to go find their husband or wife or whatever. So people hit the road right away. And it wasn't just because, as people said, well, they're lazy, they're not going to work. People were trying to reunite their families. And people were also trying to find a safe space for themselves, because they knew how cruel and brutal their, you know, supposed masters work could be. And they didn't want to get caught up in that anger, you know. And what happens is, of course, when the military's there, they have to come in and stop the what's on the other side of that, which is white brutality against these people who are now free. A lot of the forces are there to do specifically that. They might have come to protect white property and to protect, you know, white lives, but they end up having to protect Black lives and Black property, because white Southerners who have just lost the war are very angry, very upset, and are not having it in terms of, these people no longer belong to me, and these people can do whatever they want to do, come and go as they please, reunite their families as they please, ask for wages, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. You just answered my next question about the immediate impact, but I think BK has a question about the long-term impact.
Yeah, you know, I was listening to Dr. Stevenson. I was listening to your podcast again today. You know, I listened to it before, but I got the chance to kind of go back to it today. And you talked about, you referred to this long-term post-Civil War fallout as a horror show. And so for the formerly enslaved, and in what ways did the initial moment of jubilation of Juneteenth become yet another dark period for this community?
Well, the moment of jubilation is that, you know, a lot of people will talk about people didn't know where they were going to go, what they're going to do. The vast majority of people were very happy to know that they were no longer enslaved, that because what slavery meant was not just working, of course, but it meant that you had very little control over your personal being, you know, the intimate aspects of your life, your family, your movement, and that you were only allowed the very minimal material support, food, clothing, medical attention. You weren't allowed to express yourself religiously. You know, you had to hide that. Your children were given away as birthday gifts, as wedding gifts, as, you know, Christmas gifts. I mean, you know, so all these things happen. You could be forced to have, you know, intercourse with someone because you were healthy and they were healthy, and they wanted to produce healthy children that they would then enslave and sell away from you. So, you know, there was great joy at knowing that people, at least some part of that kind of horror, was not going to continue for them. But Black people soon realized that it was still not freedom in the kind of freedom that they had witnessed their past owners having. So they were not free to actually come and go as they wanted to. They were not free to, many people didn't allow them to purchase land. Many people did not allow them to be freestanding farmers, which was a skill that most people knew at the time, because 90% of enslaved people were agricultural workers. Many people did not allow them to have work animals, to have, working tools. They wanted their wives, the women, to still work rather than taking care of their children. They would come and, take the children away from them. They would sexually assault the wives. All these kinds of things happened soon thereafter. And many people promised to pay and then didn't pay either. So it's only at the end of the time period that you've been working, and now all of a sudden you go to get paid, and they've said, I'm not paying you. Why should I pay you? I've raised you my whole life, et cetera, et cetera. And then the Freedmen's Bureau will have to come in, or the military would have to come in and try to force it. But of course, that meant then you just had to get up and leave too. And of course, the KKK develops, and Night Riders develop immediately after the war is over to place Black people back into a system that looks very much and feels very much like slavery. So it was a very, very immediate jubilation, and then this harsh kind of reality that sets in, because they are not still in complete control of the situation. If the military is not there, the Freedmen's Bureau is not there to impose their freedom, it's a very difficult freedom to embrace.
It sounds like, and I want to gear this question to Dr. Joseph, it sounds like that, this initial celebration in 1865 of Juneteenth, and then you think about all the injustices that African Americans endured for such a long time. Do you feel like they wanted to celebrate this afterwards? Continue to celebrate Juneteenth, or was it going to be like a target on their backs when they did?
It's a great question. And I think that one of a theme of African American history is that I feel like it's very bittersweet, and that African Americans are always looking for reasons to find joy, even in the midst of dire, difficult situations. And so I read a quote earlier that said, from one of the heirs to the Juneteenth tradition, who was told, Juneteenth wasn't the exact day the Negro was freed, but that was the day they were told they were free, right? So that's something for them to latch on to, something to then say, okay, maybe June 18th is rough, maybe June 19th is rough, or June 20th is rough, but June 19th is a day where we're still going to be able to find joy in the progress, all as slight as it is, that has already been made. And so, it's descendants of the Juneteenth folk who put the money together to buy Emancipation Park in Houston. It's people on the local level deciding to have barbecues and read the Emancipation Proclamation. Like, you see African Americans doing this right away, despite the horror, as Dr. Stevenson so aptly provided. And then once Reconstruction really ends, so that period, between 1865 and 1877, that is supposed to literally reconstruct the United States, but also answer that big question of what does African American citizenship look like in this new world. By the time it's realized that, no, it's going to be second class citizenship, right, is how we're going to decide that. One of the answers to the fact that things don't change is the Great Migration. And so then you still see African American descendants, even as they leave across the Great Migration and go to, northern cities, western cities, they're taking the Juneteenth celebrations with them and tweaking them to fit their environment in ways that, that make sense for them at the time, depending on, their context. Then it rolls all the way into, the Black freedom movement, or, civil rights movement, into the Black power movement, that again is another push of African Americans to say, hey, July 4th does not belong to us. There's this day every year that we're supposed to be celebrating American freedom, but for many of us, that's not our holiday. And so they latch on again to this need to use Juneteenth as a moment for joy, which then eventually pushes forward to 1979 when Texas decides, okay, we will be the first state, for obvious reasons, right, to state and make Juneteenth an official state holiday. On the caveat as well that they still want to make sure that people can also have Confederates Heroes Day as well. So they balance it, right? Like it's the same sort of thing as we're talking about with the order number 3. Like, yes, slaves are free, but we got to keep these white, people. And I would even say, I like to use the term whiteness, people who deploy whiteness rather than white folks, because I think people get really like, you're talking about my individual self, and I didn't own slaves, and my family came here in 1915 when slavery was over, and this white thing, I'm not those white people. Okay, whiteness, a thing that is a privilege to have and deploy, also means that whiteness leads to, okay, you can get a Juneteenth, but we also have to make sure that people have Confederates Heroes Day and Confederate Memorial Day as well on the calendar, which is like a paid official holiday in a lot of southern states. Mm-hmm. So it's that yes, but at the same time, always, I feel like with the story of African Americans.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Segue to that, since you mentioned these state holidays, I think this week alone, both Virginia and New York have declared Juneteenth as a state holiday that would be paid. The state employees would actually be paid. We can't predict this, but do you think, either of you think that this will ultimately transition into a national holiday?
Well, I think that, first of all, I'm from Virginia, so I'm very, in some ways surprised, but also happy that this is happening in Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. But I think that it may do so, it may for many states. I mean, I think 47 states already recognize Juneteenth in some kind of way, and the District of Columbia, of course. But I think, which I think is wonderful, I think it is also important, though, that people understand that what Black people, what we really want is equality. So having a holiday is wonderful, and recognizing our history and our contributions to the nation that's fantastic. But, as this moment and movement and time now suggests very strongly to anyone who's paying attention that this is something that is much larger than a holiday. This is our continued desire to want equality, to live peacefully, to have the same kinds of resources and rights as other people in the nation. And so I'm hoping that, yes, it spreads and that people begin to really recognize the distinction between Black freedom and the creation of the nation, all right, and the ideals of the nation, but that it's more than a holiday, that it really actually becomes the time for us to have equality in a way that we have never had it.
I mean, I echo that in so many ways. It's the question of symbolic change versus like tangible systematic change, right? And so 47 out of 50 states currently celebrate Juneteenth, and plus the District of Columbia. However, a holiday is a wonderful thing. It means recognition. It means starting to open the door to, people recognizing this as something. I mean, the fact that Juneteenth is on my Apple calendar of dates right now threw me off. I was like, oh, you guys put that in there? Like, that's excellent. But like, I didn't know we were there. And it's a similar thing, like getting rid of all of these monuments right now. I mean, I can't say that those things don't bring me joy, but I don't want what I fear to happen, which is we've done it. We've made Juneteenth a holiday. We've gotten rid of some of these monuments. We've said Black Lives Matter. All right, that's it. And, history tells us that we get very excited as a country with these one-off things where it's like, we did it. Book is over. but that's not it. And I'm hopeful that we have a generation of students, because millennials like me, we tired already, but we are pushing our students, to continue to say, that's great, the symbolic change, make Juneteenth a holiday, wonderful. Change these names on these buildings at certain colleges, absolutely, do all of those things. But where are the resources in the community to actually make sure that freedom is actually finally realized, because it's still not there. And so how do we really use this time where people are looking to also then say, well, what are areas that can be invested in, rather than just let's celebrate Juneteenth and think that we've, solved racism in the way that I thought supposedly happened after Barack Obama's presidency, but again, didn't happen. So it's much more, it's beyond, just observing a holiday.
I heard something this morning on social media where someone had a quotation. It said, companies are making all these changes for Black people, like Black people weren't already here. It's like Aunt Jemima's, they're talking about removing Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, and then you mentioned all these different statues. I mean, what's your take on all these sudden movements about,
I call them low-hanging fruit.
Okay.
Call them low-hanging fruit. These are the easy things that we have been talking about for decades. I'm sure that Dr. Stevenson is, I'm a new professor in the game. I'm 3 years in, but I have classes on the Confederate monuments. I have a whole class on them. We've been talking about this, you know what I mean? Like, people have been talking about these things. I remember the class, first time I ever taught about the racist imagery in a lot of our foods and in magazines and in media. I remember one of my students was like, she's from the Dominican Republic. She came over to me afterwards. She said, I have to call my mom right now. We have to get rid of every Aunt Jemima package. I had no idea. And I was like, yeah, right. But this was in 2017 that conversation happened. And again, I don't act like I'm the first person to have had that conversation with a group of students. I'm in a long line of people who have been having those conversations. So yes, congratulations. You also are now on board with saying Aunt Jemima should not be Aunt Jemima. Let's just say, that is no longer a brand. So, congratulations. But we are way beyond that. That's not enough. And those are low hanging fruit. Take them off, but then keep on, you gotta go a little higher now.
And the thing is that's everything I wanted to say, but I want to add that the thing is that as soon as one's taken away, another pops up. Which is reminiscent of that, so that the images still don't disappear. There'll be something else. There'll be a popular story, or there'll be a popular film, or there'll be a musical or something. I mean, can I talk just a moment about Book of Mormon, for example, and those very negative. I took my husband to see Book of Mormon because it had won all these Tony Awards. It was for his birthday. We went to the Pantages, second row center, and all of a sudden it started. And we just looked around like, oh my God, what happened? Did we just fall into, some show from the 1920s or something, So, and then, and then my husband says, should we leave? I said, I don't know. Should we stay together and get better? We didn't know because it had all these fantastic reviews. It won all these awards. I go to the ladies' room. This little white woman comes up to me and taps me on the hand and says, I'm sorry. And so I'm like, oh my God, so it's just that I was looking at a film on Netflix today, and these people were at a airport store in some foreign country, and there are all these, blackface images that are like these little statues that they're selling. So no matter how we try to, we decide this, no more Aunt Jemima, no more Uncle Ben, thank you. But there are all these things that are, now we're addressing, but they continue to creep up. They are so deeply embedded in our imagination, in our society, and what it really is. What is American popular culture? What is world popular culture? But again, it's, as you say, Dr. Joseph, it is low-hanging. It is low-hanging fruit. You wonder, if it's, why it hasn't been done before, though. That just causes you to think, I mean, as you say, Aunt Jemima, are we still dealing with Aunt Jemima? And I'm old enough to know when the change had to be made to, the big controversy about Mamie on Young and the Restless, and so Mamie, who was did all the great cooking, took care of all the kids. And then finally they gave her a business and they gave her some stock and she became, wealthy and all these other kinds of things. So they evolved, Mamie into being from Mammy to Mamie to, a CEO, but those images still are still there in our society, in our imagination. They are so much a part of what it is to be American that people don't even realize that they are there, and that's what we respond to, all the time. That's what happened. I was reading this article in the New York Times just a few minutes ago about banking while Black. And I tell you about it. I mean, I told my husband, I said, that's when we decided that we would have automatic deposit of our checks because we could not get a paycheck cashed. Nobody thought we earned what we earned. Nobody thought what we had, the positions that we had. College professors don't get paid that much, but they still didn't believe it. So it's in everything that we do. It's such a difficult, going shopping and people telling you, well, this costs so-and-so, which happened to my daughter yesterday in West Hollywood. So it's everywhere you go, in every kind of perception that you have of the Black presence, so we'll see.
I mean, it's like you said, it's in all sorts of places. I mean, they really thought they got us with giving Aunt Jemima taking the, they redesigned it and they had like, if you, and they took the bonnet off and like she lost a little weight. We don't, just because she went to Weight Watchers and got her hair done does not mean that she's not a stereotype anymore. You know what I mean? Like, in that that we don't know that, you know what I mean? I think that the ignorance about this is also part of it, that they think that, like corporations or whoever are not aware that, or know that the majority of the public who is consuming their products are not fully aware of this history, don't know where these things are coming. And so they're just like, oh, it's Aunt Jemima. Like, okay, oh, look, they changed the brand a little bit. She's smiling at us now with her teeth, cute. But they don't know. And so that's when, that in itself, I think, is what's like dangerous about this, right? I sometimes think about, how, and I'm a Dave Chappelle fan, as problematic as he can be sometimes. I grew up on Dave Chappelle's show. And I remember the Rick James episode where he says that, cocaine is a hell of a drug. Racism is a hell of a drug.
Yes, it is.
And it is a very addictive thing. And it is a thing that is, even if you think you're over it, it could easily get you back. You know what I mean? Because of how pervasive these images are, these messages are, like we can't but help but absorb them. So again, low-hanging fruit. We should have been getting rid of all of these things a long time ago. But at the same time, you still have instances of, people just profiling in very microaggressive ways, which I think people in particular, is going back to that ignorance point of thinking of racism as a very black and white thing, pun intended. You're either a KKK member or you voted for Obama, which means you're not a racist. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if, that's the spectrum, right? Like, either I burn crosses or, I don't. And that's what makes me not a racist, when there's so many little things that are involved that the Black people live with and know with, deeply in them, how to act in a store, how to, again, I'll just deposit my check rather than go to the bank. Like, Black people are always having to think about and negotiate those things. And that absence of knowing that, I think, is such a huge issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think your point on ignorance is it. All four of us, we teach to some extent the history of this country, right? Let's talk a little bit about selection bias. That comes up with my students. They are wondering constantly, why are these things not in the history textbooks? Why have we never found out about this throughout the entire course of our high school career? Things like Juneteenth, or the Tulsa riots, or the Tulsa massacre of 1921, Texas Rangers. I mean, the list is long. Why do you think that these things are just glaring absences in the majority of history, American history textbooks?
I mean, our current Attorney General just said it a few weeks ago, that the winners write the history books. So when they asked him in a recent interview how he would be remembered in history books for his treatment of whatever, I can't even remember the latest investigation, but that's for another day. But he commented on it, well, I'm not worried, the winners write history. And I mean, that was just a few weeks ago. And that's why, because there is a stake in making sure that American exceptionalism is taught to kids from a really young age. It's necessary. And this is not just an American thing. My parents, who grew up in Haiti, both of them, my mother still remembers the song she had to sing about Duvalier the dictator as a child. My mother is almost 60 years old, and she can still sing that song to you, because the things that we learn at that age become formative of how we see ourselves and see the world. And if they want an American public to buy into America, the great America, the land of opportunity, America, the land of freedom, then they can't very well start American history by starting with indigenous genocide. They can't start there. They have to call them savages. That's how we get there. And then to call African-American people happy immigrants and happy workers in a textbook immediately makes it okay, because we're still living with all of that stuff. And if we were to tell kids, teenagers the truth, they'd be like, well, what? Wait a minute. I thought everybody was free. I'm confused. What are all of these other things? And that, I think they don't want that. They don't want that questioning. They don't want that that critical thought around Americanness. It's not valued in this country. It makes people call you a traitor. People say, go back to another country if you don't like it here. And I'm a child of immigrants. My parents came here, and I am proud that they came here. But also, this place can be better. Mm-hmm. And I think it's our job to push it to be better. But without that information, we cannot push it to be better, which means we end up with the status quo continuing, which I think is why history books stay away from all of this. Also, to say that most of our history books come from, one supplier who's based in Texas. Love you, Texas.
Dr. Stevenson?
Well, certainly everything that Dr. Joseph has said is absolutely correct and should be underscored, boldened, and with many exclamation points beside it. But I just want to add to that, systemic racism means that the systems of our society, in part, means that systems and institutions of our society promote it, are invested in it, and make certain that it happens, make certain that it's played out. So it is difficult to get a book published, particularly a textbook, if you write a different narrative. Right? Publishers won't do it. And not just the one, publisher out of Texas, but we're talking about university presses, we're talking about, popular presses, etc. Reviewers will review it badly. All right. People who are going to decide your tenure will decide that, this is inappropriate. And how can you, make these kinds of, statements that are not borne out by the historiography or by what other people have said. And so, people who write these books also know that they can be very much penalized if they don't go along with the prevailing narrative. It is very, very hard to change the mythology of a nation that is as powerful and as wealthy and as dominant as that of the United States of America. And people who try to change that narrative are oftentimes punished for doing so, are just swept away. And so, you don't hear it, you don't see it. I point for example, to those people who are of African descent who have been writing African American history since the 19th century, since prior to the 19th century. And they were part of when Carter G. Woodson put together the quote unquote Negro Academy in 1915 and started the Journal of Negro History in 1916. These people were thought of as being bad historians. Okay, that they could only get jobs in HBCUs. They were or high schools. They were talked about. When I was in my Yale graduate class, somebody said, "Oh, you can't use anything from these groups of people." Somebody literally said that. All right, because they're just trying to make Black people look good. They are extremely biased. They haven't done the research, etc. And the professor, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, did not open his mouth to say anything about it, about that kind of complete denial, just wiping away of these whole group of, Carter G. Woodson and Du Bois and, so many other people that, you could just go through and name, and said nothing in response to that, thing that was just thrown out by a graduate student who knew no better, who, by the way, was from Texas, but nonetheless, I'm not a Texas go. But, so one of the reasons why students don't get it, why they don't learn it, is because of those kinds of issues as well. And it's not just people who write books, it's the museums. Okay, it's the people who do the quote unquote documentaries. It's the people who do the historically based film, who write the fictional, the historical novels, etc. It's the cartoons, the animation that's based on history, supposedly so. It's everywhere. It's the story books that you read. All of this, it is all part of the plan to make America look great, to make America look great, to make us happy that we're born and raised here and that we work our entire lives here and to make the country better, etc. And so there's a lot that's invested in the tale of American history, the mythology of America as a great, and it is in many ways a great nation, no doubt.
Right.
I came from a family of people who had not gone to college, and got a PhD from Yale and teach at UCLA and have an endowed chair there. I don't know if there's another place in the world where I would have been able to do this, but we do have problems. And the only way that, we're going to allow this to be a story that everyone can tell, if they want to tell that story, is to acknowledge the difficulties that this nation has had with race and equality, and that it's not just race, but it's also, poverty, homelessness, disability, non-heteronormative, it is all these kinds of otherness that we have had with regard to allowing American citizens to be equal in the law and under the law, and in our imaginations.
One of the last questions, this has been great conversation and discussion. One of the last questions I want to contemplate with you, both of you, is considering this unrest that we're going through, the Black Lives Matter movement, all these racial incidences that are going around, the Karens that we're seeing pop up in videos and what have you. Should we as African Americans continue to recognize Juneteenth, the holiday, the celebration, its significance in history? It's not written in the books. We already talked about that. But how can we as educators provide a platform for discussion around those things that are absent in our history books?
I think that there's several parts to this. I think, as Dr. Stevenson said, there's investment in seeing this narrative of America continue to be the capital THE narrative of America. And especially in the last 20 years with the changing of, elementary education and high school education in many ways, and public schools to be focused on standardized testing, we're seeing an even bigger silence and glaring missing spot around real history and social studies education in classrooms. I mean, you even see it, I'm sure, Dr. Stevenson, you echo me on this. Lots of colleges are having to have moments like, why major in history? Why should you major in history? It's not a, people are scared to go into the humanities and to learn about them because they're even told you won't have a job afterwards. There's no reason to even study history or, any of those things. Go into business or get into med school. And not everybody's built to go to med school, right? And so, or passionate about that. So at a base level, I think it's rethinking about our public school education and what's being taught and what's being valued, so that by the time a student comes to a even high school or college classroom, I was going to mention this quickly. A student of mine, I remember, Jonathon, you brought up the Tulsa Race Massacre. I remember teaching about that in an introduction to African American Studies class, and I saw a young man in the back, heat, red, rising. And he just looked physically upset. And so I just asked him, I said, hey, are you okay? Like, I don't, Ben, are you all right? And he was like, no, I'm pissed. How am I an economics major? I am a senior. I'm 22 years old, and I've never heard of this. What does this mean? Like, how did we get here? So, I mean, like, at the base level, we're going to have to start doing some of this work earlier, because in many ways, sometimes it's too late by the time they're teenagers into full adults. But I think that African Americans should celebrate Juneteenth. I don't think that it's their job to continue on a regular basis unless they feel inclined to educate people. We live in the world of the internet. And so folks who want to learn about Black Lives Matter or the Tulsa Massacre or Juneteenth, there are resources, and it's at your fingertips. It's finding your own motivation to want to learn. And I think that that's the work that has to be done, that people have to feel inclined to want to learn about this stuff. And then taking it back to the earlier point of beyond symbolic change, right? Like, where's the action that's involved too? So, Karens and other people like saying nice things. Well, like, what does your friend group look like? Where does your workplace look like? What does the administration of your school look like? Black Lives Matter is great. You can put it up. You can say you stand in solidarity. But what do the people in charge of your institution look like? What does your neighborhood look like? When you see a person of color in your neighborhood, are you confused, or are you like, this is how it should be? It's all of those things that I think we need to start acting on, which is why I think in many ways, education for younger people is good. I believe in that. I'm a college educator. But for some of the older folks, especially folks who are educated, have a college plus degree, and have an internet, this is your time to take responsibility as a citizen and do your own research. It's not time for Black people to continue to spoon feed you and hold your hand and make you feel happy. And, when you cry or you say, but I didn't know. For people, again, college educated, plus you have been given the tools to do research, do it. The reason that you're not doing it is because you don't care, or you are comfortable with that racism drug. And so, I think I told a friend of mine, my Black filter is broken at this point, because I just think I have to reserve it for my students who are really engaged, and for the students who are going to be watching this, right? They call to you because they want to know. And for young people, I'm all about that. But for older folk, this is for you. This is on you. This is not time to be sheepish or to turn away or to not examine or to be confused. I still see people responding, all lives matter to Black Lives Matter. Why are we still saying that? You know better. Look it up. You don't want to look it up. And I think that's where we're going to continue to have to fight this issue, is people's just lack of desire to really see anything change. There's a lot of people comfortable with this, whether they say it or not. There's a lot of people comfortable with this. When are you going to work to say, okay, I'm no longer comfortable with this, and I need to educate myself. I need to go on the Googles and to educate myself on why people are frustrated and mad, and why Juneteenth should even be a thing.
Dr. Stevenson, you want to add anything?
What she said.
Well, Dr. Joseph, Dr. Stevenson, this has been such an honor. I've been truly honored to participate in this. I'm honored that you took the time to meet with us. I mean, this is exactly a 1-hour interview. Thank you for taking your time out of your summer schedule. I cannot wait for our students, for our teachers, the faculty, the parents to watch this, and for us to be able to discuss this as a community. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Dr. Joseph. I love hearing you speak. You're fantastic.
Oh my gosh, Stevenson, same. Thank you. I hope to be like you someday. I love it. And so
I wish I could be like you someday, but I can't go back.
But no, it's even as little, and I won't stay long on here, but it's even as little as have somebody like Dr. Stevenson that students can see. I mean, I don't know if it's like this for you, Dr. Stevenson, but I'm the first Black teacher for a lot of my students in their whole life. They need to see more of that in order for this to not be such a thing.
I'm many first at UCLA, so I'm glad I survived that.
It's great. Mr. Allen, I think we made a great connection here. So Chicago, LA, Dr. Stevenson, Dr. Joseph, that's great. That's fantastic. Again, thank you both on behalf of the Marlborough community and the English department, the history department. We really appreciate it. And we wish you both a wonderful summer and to be well.
Same to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that.
Thanks. Take care.
You too.
Bye.